I put a video out the other day in response to Tony Northrup's video about ISO being fake. So I wanted to try and address that. However, I think I probably oversimplified it in the other way and made it seem like there was no such thing as ISO invariance. So with this video, we're going to delve a little bit more into the whole ISO topic. Now, 2 pointers that I will bring out right away before we start. Number one, this is going to be a nerdy geek fest video. So if that is not your cup of tea, you have been warned. You can proceed at your own risk. Point number two, while this video is going to be a more in-depth look than my last video at how ISO works, it's not going to detail every single way that every single camera works, because ISO these days is far too camera specific. And there's too many different ways that manufacturers are doing this to really address all of them. So we're going to address the fundamentals in how ISO variant and ISO invariant comes about, and also what dual ISO is. But it's not going to necessarily be exactly how your camera works. On that note, usually you would wait till the end of the video to do a conclusion. However, I'm going to give you the conclusion right now, which is that since ISO is very camera specific, you really need to test it out on your own camera and know your own gear. Understand what the limitations of your camera are, what the strengths and what the weaknesses are. So with all that covered, we can crack on with the video. But before we do that, if we're going to be talking about ISO, it only seems fair that I remember to wear my ISO t-shirt. So first thing we need to do is address what is going on in a camera in its basic form. Now, I did address this in my last video, but we'll recap it just in case anybody didn't see it. So inside every camera, you have your camera sensor. So it's the sensor that obviously detects the light. The sensor's made up of millions of little photosites. Each of these photosites, when you're taking a picture, are going to be exposed to light. The light hitting these photosites is going to generate a small electrical charge, usually measured in microvolts. At the end of the exposure, the sensor will read all of those charges and it will generate an analog signal. That analog signal will be passed onto an AD converter, or an analog to digital converter, where it will be converted from an analog signal into a digital signal, as the name implies. From there, it can be then passed onto the camera's processing unit, where that will turn that digital signal into a finished file and then can be sent off to the camera buffer and onto a memory card. Now, all cameras have a base ISO value. I will correct myself from my last video where, slip of the tongue, I said base ISO is ISO 100. That is not necessarily the case. When we say base ISO, what we mean is the natural signal that is produced from the camera sensor. So any given amount of light will generate an amount of charge. If we were to just pass that charge straight through and make it a file, then that would be our base ISO. However, if we want to shoot at higher ISOs, so we want to brighten the picture up, we're not changing the sensor physically for a more sensitive sensor. So what we are doing instead is just increasing the signal that's coming off it. Now, for this, you need an amplifier. And in a modern camera, there's generally two types of amplifier you will find: an analog amplifier or a digital amplifier. So an analog amplifier, because it has to be dealing with an analog signal, is located somewhere between the sensor and the AD converter. And the digital amplifier is located after the AD converter. Now, what is the whole deal with an analog versus a digital amplifier, and why would you pick one over the other? This is where we get into the realms of signal to noise ratios. Now, as I said at the start, when we take a picture and light hits the sensor, that generates a signal. However, in all of that circuitry, there is also some background noise that is created as well. There's numerous factors as to what causes background noise. So just using an electrical circuit will generate some interference. Heat is also a big factor with interference. So the hotter a circuit gets, the more interference that is going to generate. That's why if you look at specific astrophotography cameras, they're generally nothing more than a small sensor on a ginormous heatsink. They're designed to try and keep the sensor as cool as possible, and it does make a huge difference to the noise levels that you get. But in a general day-to-day camera, giant heat sinks aren't really practical. So any picture that you take, there will be a small amount of background noise hidden in the signal. However, if you're able to shoot at base ISO and get a correct exposure, then you obviously have a lot of light around, so that is generating a naturally quite strong signal. So the background noise relative to that signal is very, very small. If, however, you're needing to bump up your ISO in your camera, it's because your image is underexposing and you're trying to brighten it up. So if your image is underexposing, it's because there's not enough light getting to the sensor, which means the signal that's being created from the sensor isn't as strong as it should be. But the background interference from all of that hasn't really changed. So the signal to noise ratio that you're dealing with is lower. When you pass that signal off to be amplified, regardless of whether you are amplifying in camera with your ISO or you're amplifying it later in post-production, not only are you amplifying the original signal, you're also going to be amplifying that additional noise as well. So there's always noise in your image, it's just a matter of whether you can actually see it over the natural signal or not. Now, the analog to digital side of things. So there's two aspects for this. First is with the AD converter and something known as quantization. I can never pronounce that properly. So when you're converting from an analog signal to a digital signal, you're going from an analog signal, which is a smooth flowing continual waveform, and you're converting it into a digital signal, which is number representation of it. So what the AD converter does is it takes the analog signal and it will measure the signal strength every so often, and it will convert that signal strength from a voltage into a digital value. The problem that it introduces is it can't always give you an accurate value in return. It might sometimes have to round up or round down to the nearest digital value. Now that in itself wouldn't make a huge amount of difference. It would give you a small margin of error, but not a huge amount. However, when we then come to amplify it, that's where it presents a problem. Because by that point, we're already converting the signal to digital. So any amplification afterwards is going to have to be either the digital amplifier or software. So all that is going to do is take those digital values and increase them by whatever factor. But then it's also going to increase that margin of error as well. So the more you push that signal, that margin of error percentage, the actual value in the difference between what it is to what it should be, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. With an analog amplifier, however, you don't get that same problem. Essentially, the analog amplifier works a bit like preamps in audio. So at the moment, you're listening to me through my lapel mic here, which is going into a Zoom H1 recorder. Now, inside this recorder, there are preamps, which are analog amplifiers. So the signal that's coming in through the microphone is actually being amplified before it's being saved as a digital file. Now, currently I have my preamp set to 40, so it's boosting that input signal. If I were to turn the preamps down, the signal would be a lot quieter, but then I could then boost it in post. So if I do that, if I turn these preamps down to nothing, then the signal's going to be a lot quieter. But I can digitally enhance it in post. But that's going to make it very, very noisy. And now we're back to 40. The reason why that was so much noisier then is because I basically reduced the signal to noise ratio that was being put into the original file, and then when I was boosting it in post, all that extra interference was being amplified as well. Now that's obviously a very extreme example, and even in that case, even with preamps, there's still background noise going on because there's background noise that's being inputted into the signal before they've reached the preamps. The reason why analog amplifiers came into digital cameras was particularly in the more budget cameras or the older style of doing digital cameras, you would have the sensor and then you would have the AD converter on the board away from the sensor. So the signal would have to travel a fair bit before it reached the AD converter. So let's say, for example, we were shooting at ISO 100 and it generated a signal of 40 decibels. And passing that signal from the sensor to the AD converter along that path would introduce an extra 1 decibels of noise. Then in that case, the signal that reached the AD converter would be 40 decibels of light signal and 1 decibel of noise. So you'd have a 40 to 1 ratio of signal to noise. If, however, the input signal was only 10 decibels, then we'd want to amplify that back up to 40 to get a correct exposure. But if we were amplifying it post AD converter, then we'd have to pass that 10 decibels over to the AD converter, which is then going to still introduce that 1 decibel of additional noise. So the signal that we get converted to digital would only be a 10:1 signal to noise ratio. So when you then amplified it back up to the original 40, that would mean your finished result wouldn't be 40 decibels of signal to 1 decibel of noise. It would be 40 decibels of signal to 4 decibels of noise. So the idea with an analog amplifier is if you put that amplifier as close as you possibly can to the sensor, then you're only amplifying the noise that comes off the sensor itself. You're not going to amplify the additional noise that you get from passing the signal to the AD converter. So your signal would be amplified up to 40 decibels and passed off, and only that 1 decibel of extra noise would be introduced. It's not going to be as clean as ISO 100 because obviously you're starting with a lower signal to noise ratio already. So when you put it through the analog amplifier, all that background interference, the electrical noise that was already coming from the sensor, is also going to be amplified. So the image won't be as clean as ISO 100 where you'd have a naturally really strong signal, but it is going to give you a cleaner output than if you'd passed it off to the AD converter and then boosted it afterwards, either with a digital amplifier or in post-processing. Now, a lot of cameras do tend to have both an analog and a digital amplifier, and you might be thinking, why do you need a digital if you're going to boost the signal with analog first? The reason for that is that generally most cameras won't use the analog amplifier for every single ISO setting that it has. It will generally amplify to particular steps, and then the digital will finish it off. So let's say with our hypothetical camera here, that it will only use the analog amplifier for whole stops, so ISO 200, 400, 800, 16, and so on. And the digital amplifier is used to do the third stop increments in between. So if we wanted to set to ISO 400, then the analog amplifier would take that signal straight to ISO 400 and the digital would do nothing. If we were going to shoot at ISO 250 in this scenario, then the analog converter would take it to 200 and then the digital converter would take it that last step to 250. Now again, certain cameras might do different things. So for example, the third of a stops under a full stop, a camera could do one or two things. It could boost the analog signal to the lowest full stop below what you're aiming for. So say we wanted to shoot at ISO 320, then the analog amplifier would take it to 200 and the digital amplifier would push it 2/3 of a stop to 320. However, the camera might also do it a different way where it over amplifies with the analog and then suppresses with the digital. So it would take it up to 400 and then would digitally bring it back down 1/3 of a stop to 320. Do you need to stop for aspirin? Because I think I do. So what's this whole ISO variant, ISO invariant argument about? Well, modern technology is forever advancing and obviously camera manufacturers are trying to get better and better performance from their camera. So the way to get better noise performance from your camera is to reduce the amount of interference that the camera is introducing into the signal. So that was the old school way of doing it, using an analog amplifier to try and keep your signal to noise ratio as high as possible. What newer cameras are starting to do is try and reduce the amount of interference that could possibly be introduced into the signal. I don't know whether Sony were the first to do this, but I believe it was their chips that started to incorporate AD converters onto the sensor. So the idea with that is rather than pass the signal from the sensor all the way off to the AD converter, you basically embed the AD converter in the sensor. So by the time the signal comes off the sensor, it's already in a digital format. Now, when it comes to ISO invariant, there's at least two different methods I've seen, and it opened up one hell of a discussion with a particular user in the comment section of my last video. Essentially, what he was claiming is that ISO doesn't even exist in the camera. It doesn't amplify the signals at all. All it is a little reminder note for your computer when you open it up. So the file that gets saved is your base ISO file and a little note that just says, this was shot at ISO 6400. When you open it up, could you just ramp it up to ISO 6400 for me so it looks like it was when he took it? What that would mean is that as long as your original exposure didn't have the highlights clipped, so you hadn't completely blown out your highlights, essentially you could just change your ISO setting and say, actually I didn't want ISO 6400, could you change it to ISO 400? And as long as the information was there, it would just set it to whatever you wanted. Now that might be the case for some cameras. So he was using a Panasonic GH5. I believe the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras might work in that same way. However, not every camera works like that because I've tested it with the A7 III. So the A7 III has two base ISO settings. I'll get onto the reasoning behind that in a moment. But essentially ISO 100 and ISO 640 are the base ISOs. By his logic and his argument, if my camera worked like that, if I set up an exposure at ISO 640 that wasn't clipping the highlights, I could then take my ISO setting to the nth degree, whatever value I wanted, and it wouldn't actually overexpose my image. It would look like it was overexposed, but that original 640 file would still be usable, so that when I opened up the image afterwards, I could just turn off the ISO and I'd still have a perfectly usable image. However, when I tested it, that's really not what happens. I took a test shot at ISO 640 and the image was not overexposed. It was my computer screen with some text on there that I could quite clearly read at ISO 640. I took that image then and ramped it all the way up to ISO 51200. So the computer screen was then showing as completely overexposed, no detail whatsoever. When I took that 51200 image into Lightroom and tried to bring the exposure down, it couldn't bring up any of the information that was hiding in the highlights. All it could do is bring what was pure white and bring it into a more grey sort of look, but there was no actual information in the highlights for me to be able to see, even though the original ISO 640 file had the information there. So, rewind. Why does the Sony a7 III have two base ISOs? It's because the a7 III sensor is designed with something called dual ISO. And again, this is something that is starting to work its way into new cameras. So the a7 III and a7R3 have it. The A9 probably has it as well. Again, I believe the Blackmagic Cinema camera does have this as well. What this is a fundamentally different design to the sensor. So most normal cameras and cameras of old, on the sensor there would be a load of circuitry that would pick up all the signal and would pass it off to the AD converter and processor. With dual ISO, however, there's actually two different circuits on the sensor. There is a low gain circuit and there is a high gain circuit. Now the high gain circuit is not just an amplified version of the low gain, because that would essentially be pointless. It's actually a circuit that's optimized for working at different voltages to the low gain. Now again, if your camera has dual ISO, the base ISOs will be at different values. On the a7 III, it kicks in at ISO 640. So if I take an image between ISO 100 and ISO 500, then it takes the signal onto the low gain circuit. If I switch up to ISO 640 and above, then the camera starts to use the high gain circuit instead. This actually results in better dynamic range at ISO 640 than I get at ISO 500. So to demonstrate this and to also show you some differences with how newer and older cameras compare to each other, I set up a test scenario using 5 different cameras. So the test setup that I had was under controlled conditions. So it was using this focus test chart that I have, which is just a black and white printed chart, and a couple of DVD boxes, only fools and horses because I like those. I basically put those in line with the test chart so that it gave me some clear detail writing and also different colors to deal with as well. That whole setup was set on a completely black background. So the background is completely void of anything, so you'll be able to see noise a lot clearer there. And the whole thing was lit with my Godox SW60 LED light at a continuous output. Now the cameras that I then used were the Sony a7 III, my Sony Nex 5, an old Canon 60D, and then I was able to borrow a Canon 7D Mark II and a Canon M5. Now bear in mind, while the 60D is quite an old camera to be fair, that 18 megapixel sensor is still being used in some low-end Canon DSLRs even today. Now for each of these I kept it as consistent as I could. Every camera was fitted with the Sigma 35mm art lens, which is a point that I want to address from my last video that a few people have brought up. Because a few people have commented that I said that f-stops were a measurement of light, and that's not correct. It's t-stops that measure light, which is true. But that's not what I said. What I said was that f-stops are a theoretical measurement of light. So two lenses, both set to the same aperture, should in theory allow the same amount of light to get through. However, they don't. In real world, there can be quite a big difference. So the point that I raised in the last video was that Tony hadn't specified how he'd done his tests, and it appeared like he was using different lenses on different cameras. So even though he was setting all his lenses to f4, the amount of light transmission through them would skew the results. So with this, I adapted the same lens to every single camera. The lens was set to f5 on every single camera, so vignetting shouldn't be a problem between full frame to APS-C. All the cameras were also set to a shutter speed of a 250th of a second. I then shot every camera in full stop steps down from ISO 640 down to 100 where it would allow me. The next 5 would only go down to ISO 200, but every other camera is 6400 down to 100. Now to summarize what they show, the older cameras, the next 5 and the 60D, when you try and boost the ISO 100 image up to ISO 6400, the difference is night and day. Newer tech such as the 7D Mark II and the M5, the difference is less noticeable, but there is a difference because all of those cameras are still ISO variants. Now with the A7 III, it did present me a slight problem because it's got the dual band ISO. So at ISO 640, that base image that I'm comparing it to, it's shot with the high gain setting. Once I drop the ISO below 640, it's cut onto the low gain. So the lower settings were trying to boost a different signal, which then produced worse results. However, that A7 III test does show two different things. One, it shows you ISO invariance. Two, it shows you the massive benefit of the dual band ISO for shooting high ISO shots, because I've also included a shot at ISO 500 and a shot at ISO 640. But with the ISO 500 shot, you can see a lot of noise, particularly white spots on the backdrop, that as soon as you step up to 640, they just completely disappear. So I'm going to leave a link in the description down below. You can download all of those raw files and you can have a play around with them yourself and you can see the different results that you get. As long as increasing the ISO in your image isn't going to clip any of the highlights, then there is absolutely no benefit to like ridiculously underexposing your shot and recovering it in post later. The best you're going to get is if you've got a truly ISO invariant camera with only one base ISO, then you're going to end up with the same result that you would have otherwise got. But if you've got an ISO variant camera or a camera with dual band ISO, then you could end up with a worse result. Now it could be that you only see a difference when you're pixel peeping, or you don't see a difference at all. But it could be that your images look like night and day. But that's it for this video. I know it was a particularly long one, but hopefully that's kind of cleared up the ISO argument a little bit more now. If you have any questions or queries, the comment box is down below. Go and test your gear out, see how well it works, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.